Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted that you're here. Welcome to this staatskantine with the one and only Simon Wardley. We're really pleased, Simon, that you're with us today. It's a privilege to be able to hear from you, from the master himself, so to speak. My name is Danny Berkeley. I have the pleasure of co-directing Staatslabor, and most of you will know us. We're a not-for-profit organization. We work with public administrations across all levels of government in Switzerland in an attempt to help them be more open, courageous, and collaborative, because we think that's needed in order to serve citizens and residents in this day and age. Simon is possibly one of the most interesting, if not that most interesting, strategic thinker that we currently have on planet Earth. I am completely convinced that the material you will see today will be part and parcel of any kind of MBA or strategy course. I think it may be 10 years. Simon thinks it might take a bit longer, but I think we both agree that it will happen eventually. So everyone who's here, you are incredibly ahead of the curve, and for better or worse, you'll probably be able to reap the benefits of the material that Simon will share for a couple of years before everyone else catches up to you. Now, for those of you who don't yet know Simon, he's a researcher, also a former CEO. So Simon is one of the rare people who's got a lot of practical experience from business. He knows what it's like to run a company. Simon also knows what it's like to advise governments. So he's plenty familiar with many of the situations that many of you find themselves in. But Simon is also an excellent researcher, not an sort of a classically trained or classical academic researcher, dare I say, but an incredibly thorough researcher. And I wanted to emphasize that because you'll see a lot of really interesting material. But what you should know is that there is an incredible amount of work and detail sitting behind all of that stuff. So you could double click on literally probably anything that Simon will show, and then you'd find out that there's an incredible depth of reflection and research behind that. Lastly, why do we think this is incredibly important? Strategic planning has got a bad rep, got a bad name, mostly for good reason. Because much of it isn't very good. But it turns out that it actually is possible to figure out the landscape that we're in, figure out the context that we're in, and then think and plan and act strategically, and also in a really collaborative fashion. In no other place is that more important than in government. And that's why we're really delighted to have you on, Simon, here, and to have all of you join in today. Without further ado, over to you, Simon.
Thank you very much. Gosh, what a wonderful introduction. I'm going to have to say, mapping may spread. It's been 17 years since I started mapping. It is growing, but you know, all maps are imperfect representations of a space. If you wanted to make a perfect map of, say, France, it would have to be the same. It would have to be one-to-one scale. It would have to be the size of France, and as a map, that would be pretty useless. So all maps are imperfect representations. They're also all models, and all models are wrong. So they're imperfect and wrong, but it turns out they're quite useful. So the first thing is somebody may come along and, you know, hopefully find a much better way of mapping than my method of mapping, and which is what you need for a field to develop anyway. So it may spread. Very, very kind things to be said. A lot of this was accidental. But anyway, so on to that point, I'm going to start off with a presentation. Then we're going to go into Miro, because I like to do practical examples. Let me give you a link to the Miro board. And let me put it into chat. Okay, this is the Miro board that we will be using. So we will get there shortly, but let's start with the presentation. So hang on, share screen. Screen 2, I have multiple screens in front of me. I built this office and all this wonderful tech and everything else. Hopefully you can see it says situation normal, everything must change. Just nod your head if you can. Oh, perfect. Thank you. Right. So this is all about change, actually, maps, and it's about changing landscapes and environments and how you deal with them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with the origin of maps, or my origin into this whole subject of mapping. And then I'm going to talk, can you please change the settings of the board? Hang on a second. I can see there's something in the chat. Let's have a look. Ah, yeah, thank you very much. Can edit. There we are. Copy the board link. I'll put that back in. Thank you. Thank you very much, Inez. I put a new link in. Just double check that's okay. Just put it in chat. Anyway, so I started off with, I'll start off with the origin, how I got into maps, and then I'll talk about maps, and then I'll talk about patterns. So for me, as I said, this started 17 years ago. I was working at this company for Tango. It was an online photo service. It was doing very well. It was very profitable, revenue growing. I had about 16 different lines of business. Probably, well, many millions of users across all the lines of business. But the problem is that, the problem the company had was actually the CEO. The CEO was completely clueless. Our CEO was making it up as they went along. And I know this because I was the CEO. I used to come up with all these wonderful statements of, visions. Our strategy is customer focused. We will lead an innovative effort in the market through our use of agile techniques and open source. This was us in 2003. A friend of mine's Kent Beck, who wrote something called Extreme Programming. So we'd adopted XP in the organization. We were heavy users and developers of open source. But I pinched these words from another company and just changed a few things. So I was starting to get a little bit concerned that people would eventually rumble that I didn't know what I was doing, what I was talking about. And so I used to read every book I could find on strategy. I was getting nowhere. And then I was in a bookshop in London in Charing Cross. And I was talking to the bookseller, and she asked me, had I ever read Sun Tzu's The Art of War, to which I hadn't. And so she persuaded me to buy 2 different books, because they're all translations. Now, I'm really grateful for this, because it was in reading the second version, I noticed a particular pattern. So Sun Tzu talked about 5 factors that mattered in competition. First, to have a purpose, a moral imperative. Second, understand the landscape you're competing in. Then understand the climactic patterns, so the heavens, so how the landscape is changing. Then understand doctrine, so these are principles of organization. And then you get into leadership and gameplay. And this overlapped with something else I was reading at the time, which was by the Mad Major, John Boyd. So John Boyd talked about something called the OODA loop, and this has been used in military circles and also now political. So you start off, the first O of the OODA loop is to observe the environment. And that's what landscape and climatic patterns are about. Then you orientate yourself around the space. That's what principles doctrine is about. Then you need to decide where you're going to act, and you act. And this is where leadership and gameplay comes into play. And at the heart of this are 2 whys. The why of purpose, so your moral imperative to do something. So if I'm playing a game of chess, my why of purpose might be to win the game. And the why of movement, why do I move this piece over that piece? So this was about 2005, 2004, roughly around that time. And I was quite excited by this because it sort of made sense. But I started to take a real interest in this question of landscape. How do we understand the landscape which we're competing in? And when I say competing, I mean there are many different forms of competition. There's conflict, obviously, fighting others. There's collaborating, laboring with others, cooperating, working with others. I mean, they're all aspects of competition. But how do we understand that landscape that we're competing in? So I got into military history. I used to read all these old books, and This is an example of a particular battle, the Battle of Thermopylae. It was ancient Greece. The Persians, there were about 140 to 170,000 Persians invading. And Themistocles decided to block off the Straits of Artemisium, force the Persians along a coastal road into a narrow pass called Thermopylae, where a small number of troops could defend against a larger force. Now, there were about 4,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans in that army. And this is where we get the story of the 300 from. Now, I was fascinated by this use of the map because you've got various options. You could defend around Thebes, you could defend around Athens, you could just, attack them with the navy. I mean, but the map is a means for multiple people talking about collaborating about what are we going to do about this particular issue. So I was looking at my organization and I'm thinking, well, how do we do this? And I used something which were called SWOT diagrams. It stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Apologies if there's any noise in the background. Hopefully the microphone will clear it out. There is some construction work going on. Okay, so I decided to create a SWOT for this battle. Strengths, a well-trained Spartan army, a high level of motivation not to become a Persian slave. Weaknesses, the E4s might stop the Spartans turning up. A truckload of Persians are turning up. Opportunities, get rid of the Persians, get rid of the Spartans. We're actually Athenian. We don't actually like the Spartans anyway. They're all actually warring with each other. And the threats, the Persians get rid of us, and the Oracle says a really dodgy film might be produced a few thousand years later. So I simply put these next to each other and asked myself the question, what would you use to communicate and determine strategy in battle? Position and movement described through some form of map or some sort of magic framework like a SWOT diagram. When I was looking at that, I thought, well, this is obvious. I mean, I've used position and movement on a map. But then I thought about my business, and what I was using was this magic framework. So that really got me into this question of maps. So the first thing I did was ask everybody in the organization to send me all the maps they had. And I got lots of maps. I got business process maps. I got customer journey maps or prototype customer journey maps. I got mind maps, lots of mind maps. I also got systems maps. So I took one of these systems maps, and this is for an online photo service. And I looked at one component in this, CRM. So, customer, we've got photo storage, we've got compute. So I took CRM and I moved it across the map. And I asked, how has the map changed? I've gone from there to there. And the answer is, it hasn't. Now, I know if I take a geographical map and I move somewhere like Australia and put it next to the United Kingdom, then that map is definitely, that's a significant change. So why hasn't it changed here? And the answer is because it's not a map, it's a graph. The one thing that all these maps had in common, business process maps, mind maps, systems maps, customer journey maps, and so on, is that none of them are maps, they're all graphs. To explain the difference, these three images at the top are identical, they're all graphs. Nottingham, London, Dover, they're three places connected by two roads, M1, M2. There are three identical graphs. The images at the bottom are three completely different maps. The difference between a map and a graph is in a map, space has meaning, which is why they're good for trying to understand landscapes, whether you're talking about geographical landscapes or economic landscapes or political landscapes or cultural landscapes. So I needed somehow to create a map. So I started looking into this question of what actually makes a map. And you need three components. You need an anchor, such as magnetic north. You need the position of pieces. This is north, south, east, or west of that. And you need consistency of movement. So if I'm going north, I'm going north. If I'm going south, I am going south. So I started, right, I somehow need to do this, but with a business. So I started with my business, but I'd like to use another example. I like to use the example of a tea shop because I love cups of tea. How would you map a tea shop? Well, you start off by going, right, what's the anchor? We've got several. You've got the public who hopefully consume cups of tea. You've got the business who wants to create revenue from selling cups of tea. You've got potentially the government who want to regulate cups of tea for reasons of health and safety. So you can have several anchors on a map. So let's just take the public and business, and there's a cup of tea. Right, where does that get us? Well, a cup of tea has needs. A cup of tea needs a cup. It needs tea. It needs hot water. Hot water needs cold water. It needs kettle as well. Something to heat the hot water, cold water in. Kettle needs power. So what I've got is a chain of needs. What I've got is a chain of needs. And of course, the further I go down the chain, the less visible something becomes. So if I'm a member of the public and I'm consuming my cup of tea, then the power to heat the kettle to make the hot water, which makes the cup of tea, is quite far removed. Now, this is still a graph. I've got anchor and position. I don't have movement. Well, it turns out all of these nodes are stocks of capital. And they're all evolving through a common process driven by supply and demand competition. You start off with the genesis of novel and new items. Then you get custom-built examples. Then you get products and rental services. And eventually you get commodity and utility services. So what I can do is I can take my graph, I take the components and just ask the question, how evolved are these components? And this is a map. If I move the position of anything on this map, it changes its meaning. What I've got is anchor, position, and movement. Now, what I'm really doing here is I'm exposing my assumptions about how to build a tea shop, and in a way that you can safely challenge them. And by safely, I mean most organizations run on stories. And the problem with stories is we tell people that to be a great leader, you've got to be a great storyteller, which means if I come up with a story and you challenge my story, you're actually saying to me, you're not a great leader. Now, if I take my story and I put it on a map, you can challenge the map without challenging me by simply going, I think there's something wrong with the map. So you might ask, where's staff? Now, normally, when we draw these maps, we put a couple of lines around them. The lines aren't really meaningful. One is for value chain, just to emphasize you're going up the value chain. And one, everything evolves. So we put a line at the bottom just to give a sense of direction. Everything is moving. So I might look at this map and go, oh, what's funny about this map? I know. Why have you got kettle and custom built? Surely a kettle should be more of a commodity. And it's always amazes me in business how much stuff we custom build, which really should be a commodity. All right, so these sorts of maps have been used for everything from putting things into space. Planet Labs, NASA, working on the Carbon Mapper satellite, they were actually using these forms of maps, or my form of maps, to run the project, to things like in UK government. I was involved in writing what's known as the Better for Less paper. We use mapping to save hundreds and hundreds of millions. And I'm going to go through some examples with you. But one of the things that happen with maps is you start to learn patterns. One of my favorite examples of this would be high-speed rail. So this is a big, heavy engineering project. It's all about railways. This is James Finley. James Finley was the CIO. Roughly 2012, they wanted to build the entire railway in a virtual world. And the reason for doing this is quite simple. It's cheaper to dig up a virtual world and go, whoops, we've got that wrong, than it is the English countryside. I mean, if you mess up the English countryside, that's going to be quite expensive. So this is the systems graph for building HS2 in a virtual world. And James's problem was, how do I manage this? Now, back in those days, the way we used to do this in government was we would go, right, let's outsource this all, but we'll break it into small lots. And those lots will be contracts, will group together similar sounding things. So we'll have lot 1, engineering things, that'll be in that contract. Lot 2, oh, that stuff is about user collaboration, we'll put that over there. Lot 3 will be back office, lot 4 is infrastructure. And these projects invariably had massive cost overruns, lots of failures, etc. So James thought, I taught him to map many years ago, he thought, try a different way. He spent Sunday afternoon and literally mapped out what they were trying to build, sent it to me, and said, how do you manage something like this? Got various components all evolving from Genesis, custom product, to all the way to commodity. Well, this is quite simple. You see, as things evolve, their characteristics change. They go from this uncharted space on the left-hand side, the Genesis, where it's chaotic, it's uncertain, it's undecided. And as they evolve, they become more industrialized, more commodity-like, more standardized. And what we'd learned back in 2006 is there's no such thing as one-size-fits-all methodology. It doesn't matter whether I'm talking about project management or purchasing. So for project management, extreme programming, agile in-house development was very strong on the left-hand side of the map, because it was all about, your focus had to be reducing the cost of change, and that's what extreme programming does very well. It reduces the cost of change. But as things evolved, the same thing over time will evolve and end up on the right-hand side of the map. This is where Six Sigma outsourcing really works well, because there you're not focused on reducing the cost of change, because change is not what you want. What you want to do is reduce deviation. So you want incredible standardization. So this is where Six Sigma works. Of course, in the middle, you're all about learning. So here you're all about, you're between the transition between those stages. So you're all about learning and reducing waste. So things like Scrum, MVP, all this sort of stuff makes sense. So you just simply applied that. We said the stuff on the left-hand side, this is the stuff that we need to build in-house. The stuff in the middle, this is the stuff which needs to come from off-the-shelf products. And the stuff on the right-hand side is the stuff that we need to outsource to other suppliers. Or if you're going to build it, if you have to, you're going to follow an approach of Six Sigma. So that's what they did. And this project ended up in front of the Public Accounts Committee, because it delivered way ahead of schedule and way under budget. And it's simply by the use of appropriate methods. Now, let's go back to the original sort of view, which is the contract structure type view. We've got a systems graph, not a map. We've decided to break down a few components into a contract called engineering. Let's take that and put that on the mapping format. That contract looks like this. Now, I can tell you that contract is going to fail before we've even signed the paperwork. And the reason why it's going to fail is because in the contract, we're going to try and specify what we want to be done. And the stuff on the right-hand side can be specified. It's more industrialized. So those bits will be efficiently treated. But the stuff on the left-hand side, you cannot specify because we're still learning. So we're always going to incur excessive change control costs. When it comes to projects, some of the most common things I see are people not understanding who their users are, not understanding their user needs, not understanding the components, i.e. the supply chain involved, misapplication of methods, so doing Agile everywhere or Six Sigma everywhere. Most contract structures are flawed. And then another thing you note is that once you start to build up more and more of these maps, you start to find patterns between maps, but you also start to find duplication. So you'll find the same thing being rebuilt, often in many different ways. Give an example, the worst example of duplication in a government space is we've got 118 workflow systems doing exactly the same thing, which is prisoner registration. We've managed to build that 118 different ways. But if you want waste, then government's an amateur at waste compared to the private sector. I mean, I've got a pharma company who's got 350 teams building enterprise content management systems and 3 global efforts to build the global enterprise content management system, none of which know the others exist. I've got a bank which we stopped counting risk management systems when we hit 1,000. I mean, they've managed to build risk management over 1,000 different ways, and they're always complaining they can't innovate because they built all this nonsense, which sort of basically prevents them from doing anything. So, please don't, compared to the private sector, government is usually a bastion of efficiency. And the private sector is up to its neck in waste. And the reason why banks like this can get away with being so wasteful is because they're competing against other banks which are exactly the same. I mean, if everybody in the race is a donkey, it's okay being a donkey. I said about collecting maps. One of the things that we do is we do pre-mortem, post-mortem learning with maps. So pre-mortem is all about challenge. It's all about getting people to sit down. What are you trying to do? Let's draw a map. Let's just put some challenge on the map, not against the person, but the map. And that's something which we started with the UK government in a group called Spend Control. Of course, then people go and build stuff. And what you want to do is post-mortem learning. So this is where they should come back and you've got the map and say what actually happened, because it's through that post-mortem learning that you learn patterns. And there's a lot of patterns with maps. So there's climatic patterns. These are universally, these are almost like the universal rules of the game. There's about 30 of them. Things like everything will evolve. As things evolve, you're going to have inertia to change because of past success. This is all Creative Commons, by the way. I'm not going to go through the details of this. It'll take too long. There's about 40 universally useful principles, which we call doctrine. Things like focus on user needs, understand the components in your chain, understand how evolved the components are, remove bias and duplication. And then there's about 100 different forms of gameplay, ways of manipulating the space to your favor. Again, I've got tables of this. It's all public. You'll find books out there. This is AWS, has got a book called Reaching Cloud Velocity. They've got 17 pages of my mapping in it. So this is AWS itself. One of its, AWS occasionally publishes its own books. It's got about 17 pages of mapping in there, including a model called ILC, which is used to chew up industry after industry. Very simple stuff. I used to run strategy for a company called Canonical. We provided something called Ubuntu. This is 2008. We're up against Microsoft Red Hat. We're 3% of the market. We simply mapped it out and used the map to attack the space. Cost us $500,000. 18 months later, we was about 70% of all cloud computing. It's quite remarkable what you can do if you actually understand the environment. So if everybody's a donkey and you're a racehorse, you can pretty much win it every time. So I've got a current research project with 207 people involved, all volunteers, mapping out government, healthcare, defense, agriculture, education, construction. These are all looking at different areas of investment in these spaces. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go onto the mirror board. I'm going to take you through a few examples, and hopefully we'll touch on this research as well, and a particular question, which is digital sovereignty. So what I'm going to do is I will stop this. Just going to move things around a little bit, and then I'm going to open up the mirror board. And I can see we've got 19 people on there already. Fantastic. Let me just put the link in chat one more time. Do come and join, and I will share the screen. So if you're, you can see what's going on as well. Okay. Right. So mirror board. Fairly straightforward. Left-hand side, you've got basically abilities to create little post-it notes. You can bottom right-hand corner, you can expand, zoom in, etc. So let's go and zoom into that post-it note. There we are. You can put some text in there, hello, whatever it happens to be. So pretty, it's fairly standard like most of these sorts of whiteboarding platforms. So the first thing I'm going to do is unhide this tea shop example. I'm going to bring everybody to me so you can see where I am. I'm going to use the bottom right-hand corner to expand. All right, I'll bring everyone here. All right, so whenever mapping, the first thing I will start with is by asking who are the users and what are their needs? And that's actually quite a tricky one. So when I was mapping with the prison service, you'd go, who are the users? And they would go judiciary, the public, government. Eventually, you'll get somebody to realize prisoners are actually users and they do have needs as well. So it's important to try to identify who the different users are and also what their primary needs are. The next thing you do is try and understand the details. So we start going, right, public needs a cup of tea, needs hot water, needs kettle, needs power. So at this point, we're graphing. Okay, and so we might go, like, I've got business, I'm going to bring business in here and revenue in here. We'll make a connection between those two because business needs to make revenue from there, from tea. We might bring a new component in here, milk. I will say tea needs milk as well. Now this gives me a graph. This is not a map. What I now want to do is start building a map, which is what I've done in this example here. And so I might go, right, business. Well, what do we think business is? Well, pretty common idea, more of a commodity. We'll put revenue. Well, that's very common. So we'll make those commodity. Milk. Yeah, nothing special much about milk. So we're going to put this down over here. So what we're doing here is simply adding those components and making judgment calls about how evolved something is. So what I want you to do is the 30-odd people who are on the board, I'm going to give you 4 minutes. Let's bring a timer up to add more things to this tea shop. So think about what's missing from this chain. Put a note on here and link it to where it should be. Think about how evolved that component is. And let's give you 4 minutes. Off we go. Oh, straight away. Let's have a look. What are people bringing in? Honey, takeaway cups. Yeah. ESG scoring for tea suppliers. I think that's an interesting one. I'm going to drag ESG. I'm not disagreeing with you here. I just think the map ESG is more in the custom built. We're all over the place with ESG at the moment. So I'm going to drag it over. We shouldn't be, but I think we are. You, of course, can disagree and drag it back. Spoon, yeah. Accounting, yeah. Oh, let me. Okay, what else we got? Staff. I'm going to be terrible here. I'm going to bring chairs. I'm going to say in tables. I think they're more heading towards the sort of commodity. I think it's going to be brutal. I'm going to say staff. We're going to bring over here. Location, store, relationship to tea grower, marketing. Oh, I think marketing's well commodity. I mean, well, all right, so we'll put this over here. Advertising, tea tree. Yeah, okay. Metal. Oh, we don't want to cuss. Well, absolutely. When we think about the, if you go down the supply chain of a kettle, obviously we've got the supplier, The supplier has their own map, which they're at the top of the map, and the need they need to meet is providing kettles. All of this stuff is, you can zoom in recursive. Every single node could, in fact, be a map. And of course, there's metal and mining in those chains as well. So yes, unique tea mix recipes. That's a really interesting idea. That is. That's a bit like the Mini. I have a Mini, and basically when you go along to buy your Mini, mine's very old, you get a choice of different tire types and different body and different colors and all the rest of it. It's all incredibly commoditized, but they give the illusion of choice through that permutation. So, you got 7 different tire types, 4 different bodies, sort of like 15 different sort of colors, 10 different interiors. And just that gives you that multiplication, gives this illusion it's unique to you. But really, tea, you're just talking about combinations of tea. So we'll often use like marketing to try and persuade you that it's special and unique to you, but, we'll industrialize the system. So you'll just select very commodity brands were combined together in a little software system to mix it in an industrialized mixer. So staff, I think we got staff over there. We've already got, so we've got a bit of duplication, which is good. Location, store, relationship to grow, and you've got 4 seconds left. Great. All right. So that's the process of how to make a map. It sounds ridiculously simple. So let's give you another example. I'm just going to move over to question 2. Let me bring you all to me. This is from an insurance company. Sorry. Let me unhide this. Right, so this insurance company, this is around about 2011. They've got a process flow here. They need a small compute. They would order server would go into goods in, they'd modify, mount, and rack it. Now they had a bottleneck because they're growing so rapidly. They had a bottleneck about getting servers into their data centers. So they came up, and unfortunately, for various reasons, sometimes these installs, it's a manual process, human process, that failed. So they came up with this idea of using robotics. So they'd literally automate the data center. And they spent 6 months looking at different vendors, and they'd done the calculations here. Cost of install failure was about $2,500. Percent likelihood of failure, current system versus robotics, so average cost of failure per install, time to install, labor cost of install, annual numbers of install. So they'd worked out, what the total cost of install was, total cost of failures were. So it's a big difference in total annual cost between $2.6 million using the current system and potentially $185,000 using the robotic system. But of course, the robotic system had a capital investment required of $2 million. So this was the case given with a return on investment sub 1 year. So I want to ask you a question. Looking at that graph and looking at that data, I'm going to give you a vote of, do you think this is a good idea or not? Yes or no? So you'll get 1 vote. I'm going to give you 1 minute to decide. You can say 1 minute to read through. Let's give you two minutes and see. 1 vote per object. And I've done this before, so I'm going to start. I'm going to say yes, but I'm going to see what the rest of you think. Good idea or not? Right, 14 have so far voted. You've got a minute left. You vote just by the little bottom right hand corner of the yes or no, there's a little plus. There's 20 odd seconds left. Do 24, you're almost. Final one. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Right to the very end. There we are. Right, let's have a look at the results. 19 say yes. 5 say no. Okay, somebody who said no. Could they come off mute just for a second? Would they mind just explaining why they thought no? No?
Probably because things are going to turn out much more complicated than they anticipate.
Okay.
This is why I instinctively said no.
So you feel it's a trap? The question.
Yes.
Okay, interesting. Well, these people aren't daft. They'd spend a lot of time looking at this problem. My apologies, I'm just going to restart my Miro just for a second. Some reason. There we are. Be back on it in a second. For some reason the screen. Right. Very helpful, Miro. Stop providing notes when I don't need them. Okay, so what I'm going to do is unhide this. So when I was given this problem, the issue is they'd spent 6 months working on this. They'd come up with their plans and everything else. So if you went in there and said, I don't think robots are a good idea, they would go, well, blah, we've done all this work and everything else. Here's our business case, etc. You couldn't challenge or question the idea of doing the robots. So I asked them, would you mind mapping it? And there was a lot of sort of, oh, we're not sure about that. It took 15 minutes for them to actually map it, probably about 15 to 20 minutes of them complaining about mapping, so maybe half an hour in total. And so they went, right, user needs compute we put in product, and they need order server and goods in. Order server, more commodity, goods in, very much commodity. Obviously, I'm looking at this thinking, why have you got compute and a product and server as commodity? That's okay, though. And then they went rack, mount, modify. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to, in the gray box over here on the right-hand side, so I'll bring you all to me anyway, just in case anybody's a little bit lost. In the grey box over here, can you put, looking at the map, please put post-it notes for any questions that you want to ask about that map. Have a look. Why do they need to modify the rack mounts? Why are racks custom built? That's so commoditized. Right. Okay, fantastic. It took you approximately 30 seconds. What does custom built mean exactly? Right. Okay. Wow, I'm going to stop because you were so fast. So when they first drew this, and by this we, Genesis is where it's the first time anybody's ever done that. Custom built means there's no product you can buy. So you're going to have to build it yourself somehow. products, you start being often have differentiation, different products. There's something called the cheat sheet, which has a list of characteristics. This all comes from analysis of publication data, but there's a long list of characteristics for each of these different categories which you can use. And I'll provide a link which will lead you to a whole bunch of different resources. But that rack question, that was the first thing that's struck me was, why have you put rack in custom built? And it turned out they had a company that made their racks for them. And so then I asked, well, what are the modifications, which was the next question, you put in one of your post-it notes, you're making to the servers. Well, the servers they bought didn't fit their racks. So they had to take the cases off them, drill new holes, add new plates in order to get them to fit their racks. And that's why you need robotics, yes, because that process was quite faulty. Now, these people aren't daft. These people are simply trapped by context, a past story. At some point in time in the past, it made sense to have custom built racks. And so they just continued with that process. But having on a mat, what happened is somebody did exactly what you've just done, is ask the question, why have we got custom built racks? Now, I've got to say this, along with not understanding users, their user needs, the components involved, not a misapplication of methods, and contract structures being flawed. This is probably one of my other big ones, and massive amounts of duplication. With, you can use maps to find duplication between maps. For whatever reason, we seem to singularly fail to do that any other way. But this is one of the other big problems, is that what people are doing here is they're focusing on process flow, which is this bit here. All right. So robotics is all about improving that process flow. What they should have been doing, and we'll eventually realize, is thinking about what we call evolutionary flow. So racks are over here. You can keep on optimizing with robotics. It's not going to solve your problem with you. And of course, as soon as they started to realize that, they went, well, what are we doing messing around with compute? That really should be over here as well, which it was with cloud. Now, as I said, these people aren't daft. They were simply trapped by past history. I've seen agencies and units within government do things, this is private sector. I had an agency within government which was investing in a digital transformation of its weighing machines. And by that, what it meant is it had these big weighing scales, and it weighed paper forms. And what it wanted to do was have new digital weighing scales, which fed directly into the system. And you go, what are you weighing paper forms for? To work out the count, the number of paper forms we're getting. So that's how. Oh, right, okay. So you weigh how many tons, and you can work out the count. So I simply started mapping this out and asked the question, where do the paper forms come from? Went to goods in, and where do you get them from? Distribution sites. Turned out we had 43 different distribution sites. Went to a different distribution site to find out where the paper forms are coming from. They're printing them out. Where are you printing them out from? Well, our customers fill in a form online, and we print them out, and then we send them to this other group. What does that group do with them? Don't know. They weigh them to see how many you printed out. It all made sense at some point in time, but because things had evolved, because forms have become digital, you'll often find these sort of strange orphan examples of things we do which just don't make sense. Right. So now I'm going to give you another one. Elvish car. To most people who are not in IT, most IT sounds a bit elvish. So what I've done is I've taken a self-driving car and I've translated it all into Elvish for you. This is the system graph. And you've got some little dots over here, outsource or buy a product or build your own. I'm going to give you 1 minute to decide which bits you should outsource, which bits you should build your own, which bits you should buy a product for. Off you go. And this is, as far as I can see, a highly realistic example of how people who are not in IT get asked these questions about how we should manage things. Yeah, and people try and answer. Of course, it doesn't take long for us to realize that no one has a clue. All right. Okay, so we'll stop that one. I'm now going to move along, bring you to this one. So I'll bring everyone to me. So the next one along, question 5, Elvish again. I'm going to give you another minute. Whoops. The same thing. Off you go. It's the same diagram in terms of a self-driving car, all in Elvish. If you disagree with somebody's put something, you can always just move it, which somebody has. Okay. All right. Becomes a lot easier to sort of have a discussion about these things. You know, if somebody comes along and say, hey, we're going to build this stuff in-house, and you can see it's all in-house and it's on one part of the map, you go, why? Why are we doing this? Why are we custom building this? Of course, if you've got the language and everything and you can interrogate it a little bit more, that's great as well. But this all helps with that process of challenge. So I'm now going to get on to another question, which is digital sovereignty. So let's move along. Bring you all to me. This I got dragged into the House of Lords the committee, so a group presentation there. So this is a map. Well, no, it's not a map. It's a graph. This is a graph of the automotive industry. It's basically some nodes and connections. And the SI is where China is doing strategic investment. So what I want you to do is have a look at the graph. Can you say any sort of comments about what China is doing? And also any comments about where digital sovereignty matters on this map? And I will give you, it's quite a tough one, I'll give you 4 minutes. There's a little grey box next to it if you want to put post-it notes. So I want you to think about, how is China playing this? What's China doing? And also, when it comes to digital sovereignty, how does this graph help us? You know, what do we need to focus on? IoT trying to be embedded in many other systems. Yeah. Investing in indispensable commodities. Yeah. Trying to control the backbone. Good, yeah. Mastering the commodities. Now this is a graph. So what makes you think they are? So they are, well, it's good, you know. I did this piece of work on China, actually, it was 2015. And it was interesting because I had a particular university had about 5,000 different supply chains, which graphed out and couldn't understand quite how the game was being played. So I started mapping them, and then I published something on this. This is gosh, 7 years ago. Intelligent bits trying to monopoly commodities. Good, right. So I am curious how, from a graph, that you picked up they're trying to monopolize commodities. Does somebody want to comment on that?
Well, it's just a bit of a hunch, but looking at the SIs, these are things that that we use that I think nobody would want to start building from scratch today. A CPU, you buy it, power supply as well, etc., etc.
Yeah. Okay, so let me show you in a different view. So let's move you along to here. Oops. And there's the mapping form. And so when you look at the mapping form, I mean, China's been, I've got this for the last 30 years, has been focused on, you're absolutely right, industrialization in the commodity space and basically moving up the value chain along that space. So, and you do this with all the different supply chains. It's the same game. It's in fact the same game that Amazon plays. Amazon doesn't innovate, it industrializes, and it constantly moves up the right-hand side of the chain of very much the commodity utility space, and enables people to build on top of its components and uses that to move further up the chain. So you're absolutely spot on. We've been doing this for about 30 years, all the way from footwear to aeroplanes. It's quite remarkable when you actually map out the chains, and of course it's a little bit more tricky to see this if you don't, except for but anyway, so that is absolutely the space that they're doing is moving up here. So now I've got a question for you. What about digital sovereignty? What does that matter? How do you reference that? What does that mean on in this graph? Did anybody talk about it? All right, well, let me expand this and I'll draw on it just to explain. When you look at a map, it's like a geographical map. You have to decide where your borders are going to be. Whenever you're talking about sovereignty, you're talking about borders, territorial borders. If you're talking about physical landscapes, economic borders, if you're talking about economic landscapes, same with political, cultural. It's all about where your borders are going to be. And in particular, where you're going to conflict, where you're going to cooperate, where you're going to collaborate. Those are the sorts of things that you would do. So you might look at this map, and one of the things about society is very much defined by values. And by the way, these square versions, rather than circular, that just means it's a symbol. It just means there are multiple things with that meaning. And when you look at societies, we have different values, and those values are often embedded in simulation models, which is what we train intelligent agents with. So currently there's a lot of work goes on in terms of immersive video games and embedding beliefs and values in those. We've used art as a way of manipulating cultures for quite some time, whether it was with statues or music or paintings or Hollywood or books, and the largest form of art today is immersive video games, which is why you get organizations like Hezbollah producing AAA video games. They're not producing them for fun. They are a way of manipulating values, perceptions, and beliefs within populations. But another way of doing that is just to embed it in something. So it's the what do we call it? It's the trolley problem. If a car's coming along and can self-driving car and it has to take out one person or 5 people, who does it take out? Well, if you're in a Confucian style society, it's the 5 people. who survive, and it's the one person who's gone. But if you're in a society which is dominated by money and 5 people are unemployed and one person is very wealthy, it might be tough luck for the 5 people. So the point about this is when we think about things like sovereignty and we think about digital sovereignty, you might start going, well, we see this stuff here where we've got intelligent agents, values, simulation models. This is the stuff which we're going to conflict over. You know, this is where we're going to have a hard border. And, you know, we're going to define the values being these intelligent agents are being trained on. You might also look on this map and go, well, hang on a second. Well, we'll pick another area: materials, fabrication, manufacturers, CPU, assembly, sensors. This may be something which we will collaborate on with others. And you might say, you know, the rest of the stuff at the top, we're just going to leave that for, you know, standard sort of competition. We might cooperate with nations, so we'll do trading agreements, all that sort of stuff. So we'll cooperate, we'll have trading agreements, etc. We might collaborate down here. We might conflict on this particular space. When it comes to things like digital sovereignty, it's no different with territorial sovereignty and other areas. It's about understanding the landscape, understanding the spaces in the landscape, where you cooperate, where you conflict, where you don't. Now, I'm just mindful of the time, because I just want to take you just to one last place. I have 12 research groups who are researching. They're all volunteers using maps. And I'm going to bring you all to here. Let's unhide this. What they're researching is, oh, someone's moved that across, that's okay. What they're looking at is investment. So, for example, we'll take defense. They start off with selecting words, you know, what words matter. So radar, you know, readiness, space command, botnets, propaganda. And then they start aggregating these words into common themes. And off those common themes, intelligence sources, military doctrine, gray zones, then they start mapping out these spaces. And when they start mapping them out, then we have this discussion about where to invest, and what we're doing is collecting this, and we're discovering that there's, by trying to understand the landscape, actually, you come up with very different answers from what most analysts say matter. But I just want to point this one particular map out to you, the one in red. So I'm just going to bring everyone here. This is defense and supply chain. So it starts off with this idea of government at the very top. Needs a society. Societies don't need government. Government definitely needs a society to govern. You've got governments also need legitimacy, which means you've got different areas of sovereignty you operate over. Territorial, i.e. you own the space, economic, security, cultural, political, digital. Each of those have a theatre. So territorial operates over the theatre of land, sea, air, and space. Economic operates over theatres of cyber and physical supply chain. Security, CNI, is a special class of things which affect our perception of success. We can't afford to lose them like electricity and hot water, because you can get away with convincing the public that most things are okay most of the time, unless you lose any of these. Anyway, what is very noticeable on the map is territorial awareness is actually pretty good. We're actually quite good at things like radars, maps, situation rooms when it comes to geography. But unfortunately, our supply chain awareness and digital chain awareness is extremely poor. Most organizations, commercial organizations, know one up, one down, who we bought from, who we sold to. If you're lucky, you might get a few who graft a little bit more and may have even graphed down the supply chain. It's, you know, it's quite, I used to work in the environmental field. It's and the reason why I made the comment about ESG is it's very difficult to estimate the impact and harm things caused if we actually don't understand the supply chains and in detail. And graphing is extremely useful, but it's not good enough to show actually the patterns. We actually need to map it as well. So there's a handful of companies in the world who are good at this stuff in terms of digital chain awareness, supply chain. Very few though. Amazon has a great group who do this sort of stuff. Most, maybe if you're lucky, you're going to get graphing. Most one up, one down. I mean, understanding of chains is very poor. There is a lovely example from Hungary. Hungarian government has used transaction level VAT records to graph out. It's not a map, but to graph out the economy. So I don't know what the state in Switzerland and industry is. I mean, if you have VAT level transaction records, it's got to be transaction level recorded. You can actually use that stuff to graph it. Graphing, of course, is a lot better than stories and just knowing one up, one down. Obviously, it's not quite where maps are. So I suppose that leads to the point, which was, unfortunately, industry is highly reluctant and resistant to do this sort of stuff. Ultimately, you're going to need a department of supply chain somewhere in government, if not for defensive reasons, for industrial reasons. At that point, I'll stop. You've all gone silent. Have I horrified you all?
No, you haven't. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. Simon, we'll make the most of the sort of 3 minutes we've got left. So we'll do rapid fire questions, one or two. We'll see how we go. If you've got a question, raise your hand and then I'll call on you and then go ahead and unmute yourself and speak. I'll give you one very quick one while everyone gathers their thoughts. We've talked about mostly sort of products and services and their evolution. What about the evolution of ideas, thoughts, ideologies, Simon?
Oh, sure. So I do, I'm showing you a tiny small aspect of mapping. So, you can map against practices, so physical things that we actually do, practices, activities, data, knowledge, ethical values. So I do mapping of cultural systems. And so on a single map, you might have cultural systems on the map, physical systems, the actual practices we're using. There may be aspects of data and knowledge in there. All of those things can be mapped. The difference is that the pattern that we found, or I found back some 17 years ago, the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4. When we talk about physical activities, we go genesis, custom, product, commodity. When we go talk about practice, novel, emerging, good, and best. When we talk about data, are modeled, divergent, convergent, modeled. We use different labels for those things, which is also why when you look at the defense map on that mirror board, you'll notice, if you look closely, these are all live maps going on at the moment, that the label at the bottom says Genesis concept, custom emerging, product converging, commodity accepted. Sometimes we extend the label because there are other labels you can use as well. And so it just makes it easier when we're combining values and practices with physical activities. But you can map all those things. But only within the sphere of competition. That's a big limitation. Competition, the act of seeking with others, has those 3 basic forms of conflict: cooperation, collaboration. But competition drives supply and demand, and that causes that process of evolution. Where do things come from before Genesis? And what happens after they become a commodity? What do we do? Those are outside the realms of that map. This is where you get into social values. So we are a limited window, but at least it's a window of sorts.